Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be at the Danish Institute of International Studies for this presentation. It's a great opportunity to continue the dialogue with the Danish friends and colleagues on defense matters. I must say it's the second time I'm in Copenhagen in months, so but I certainly start to enjoy it because the weather is much nicer than in Paris, at the moment at least. I'm very thankful to the Danish Institut of International Studies for organizing this, and of course to the French Embassy and the Institut français for making this possible. And thank you very much to the ambassador for having taken this initiative. When we first started planning this session, I expected to be in a position to present and comment the French white paper on defense and national security. Its publication has been delayed, which is making my position both easier and slightly more complicated, since I will not be basing my comments on an official document that is available for discussion. But on the other hand, I'm rather fortunate because I can say I'm absolutely free to share a personal analysis, and you will have more of a sort of personal input into the debate, more than a comment on an official position, which I think is useful for all discussion. We titled the conference France and the Security Challenges of Today, and I try to first of all, briefly outline sort of the basics of the French defense policy. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with that, but I wanted to lay them out very quickly, and then go into the core issues and the challenges that we are confronted with. So let me briefly start by those very quick reminders. As you know, France is, right after the UK, the second largest defense spender in Europe, spending on average in the last few years 32 billion euros on defense every year, and that excludes pensions. It's less than the defense budget together, which makes it one of the second largest budget in Europe, and one of the largest budget in the world, still, after the US, China, Russia, and the UK. In fact, we are still in that league. The one element that you're obviously very familiar with is that France is a nuclear weapon state since 1960. And continues to keep an independent deterrent with a fleet of 4 submarines and an airborne fleet that is nuclear capable. Altogether, the French still have 300 nuclear weapons. This figure has been given by the President as part of a transparency measure, which is about half of the peak of the stockpile during the Cold War. We also still devote about 3 billion euros a year to the nuclear deterrence, which makes it quite a significant share of the defense budget, as you noticed. We've also been since the end of the Cold War, a very significant force contributor to NATO, EU, UN crisis management operation. Always ranking amongst the top contributors to most of the operations engaged under the UN, the EU, or the NATO flag. There is one exception to this, of course, which was not under any of these flags, which is Iraq, of course, which is one of the few conflicts in which the French were not engaged in the last 20 years. During the last decade, we had on average more than 10,000 troops deployed in operations abroad, with the peaks closer to 20,000. As an example, in 2011 alone, we were engaged in 3 very significant operations, namely Afghanistan, Libya, and Ivory Coast. And on top of these three, we were also present in Kosovo, in the Baltic policing, and in multiple UN operations, like in Lebanon, for instance, plus various smaller operations in Africa. So this is a sort of enduring presence which in international security, which makes it a bit definitely France a form of interventionist country in a way, where the use of force and the use of military capabilities is definitely very much part of our foreign policy. And I must say that the changes in political leadership, which do occur regularly in the French system, do not change that very much. If you look at President Hollande, his decision to go into Mali came very quickly after he came in office, and in fact, the depiction of President Sarkozy being a bit trigger-happy, as some have said, was in fact following a tradition of many of his predecessors and successors, in this case, of French leaders deciding to use force in order to manage some of the international crisis. The interesting thing is that those operations also benefit from a very, very broad political support in France. And there is a very vast majority of the political spectrum and the population that is supportive of these international military commitments, with usually very, very high support in the polls. And you only when the operation becomes, tends to go for too long, that we see some sort of more limited support. But even with Afghanistan, where that phenomenon did happen, the population was still supportive till very late in our commitment there. This support for operation also is connected to a broader, very robust support for national defense in France, where you do see a form of consensus on defense, I must say, political consensus that covers not the entire political spectrum, but most of the parties that have a chance to be in charge. So the Socialist Party, the Conservative Party, the Centre Party, and even the Greens have been quite supportive of many of the operations. So you will only find dissenting voice either on the far right or the far left, but more on political grounds than anything else in this. Interestingly, this sort of robust consensus applies to operations, applies to the nuclear policy as well, where there is quite a strong support as well, and finally applies to the overall good image of the armed forces in our society. And there are only very marginal exceptions to that in the French debate. Having said this, the big issue that we are confronted with at the moment is to see whether this policy of military engagement, of military spending, is sustainable and reasonable in the long term. Because of course, as every European country, we are confronted with a financial crisis, with budget constraints that are weighing quite heavily on our ability to do that. And this is, in a way, part of the purpose of the current review, because as I was mentioning, we are currently preparing a new white paper on defense and national security, which will be a review of the one published in 2008. And one of the issues is to know whether the sort of ambitions laid out by the 2008 white paper for a rather comprehensive national security and defense strategy, which did and still does require a significant investment in defense, will be kept in the foreseeable future? I will try to answer this question with I definitely think that there is no reason to see France vanish from the military sphere, but there are some issues on whether it will be able to keep the same level of ambitions and the same pace of intervention as well. Obviously, the strategic environment has not seen major improvements since 2008, quite the opposite in my view, and the financial constraints are making the fulfillment of these ambitious objectives more and more complicated to achieve, which is opening a huge debate on what are the best ways to achieve that in Paris. Let me start in looking at those challenges by the strategic assessment of France and how France does perceive its strategic environment. I must say that since 2008 and the previous white paper, the situation has not changed in a dramatic fashion. The 2008 white paper identified what we call the arc of crisis, which was a region coming from West Africa into Central Asia as not only the main region for concern from a security perspective for France and Europe, but also the main region for our own intervention, the sort of priority region for our intervention. Probably this has been confirmed, and we've seen more crises in this region. We've seen that weak states continue to exist and create security challenges. We see the continuation and the continued existence of terrorist groups in this same region from the West Sahel to Pakistan. The second highlight of the 2008 white paper was the strategic importance of Asia, and this has been clearly, I think at the time, some said it was a bit of a general comment. It is clear that when you look at trends in defense spending and the growing tensions in South China Sea and in East Asia, this course is unlikely to change. The third element was the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and missiles. Unfortunately, since 2008, we haven't found a solution to the Iran nuclear crisis, and we haven't found, and we see that the developments in North Korea are extremely worrying. So, on that field again, I can see a form of continuity. There was an emphasis on new threats, and here again we see things such as cyber, and this has been confirmed as well. And finally, there was an element probably which was highlighted, and that is all the more true, as I'll come to in a second, is the fact that there are some instabilities on the borders of Europe. Even if we don't face an immediate military threat of the type we faced during the Cold War. There are two developments that are, I think, significant from a French perspective. Of course, the Arab Spring is one of them. It is indeed full of democratic opportunities and that we should try to push forward, but it also created a vast area of instability on Europe's southern border for a period that could last for years. And if we take an optimistic scenario, which I still hope is valid, that ultimately the evolution of these societies will lead to a more stable and prosperous North Africa and Middle East, it's clearly not going to happen overnight, and we will probably face an extended period of time with major instabilities, and we should probably also look at this Arab Spring country by country, and we see that the evolutions are very different from one country to another from that perspective, creating new forms of uncertainties in regions that are extremely close to our border from a French perspective, but are also very much connected to France because of for first of all, the colonial past, of course, but also the fact that our populations are extraordinarily mixed with large numbers of North African and African nationals in France. The second development I would like to highlight in that context, and I think is extraordinarily important and probably a bit underplayed in Europe at the moment because we don't like it, because it forces us to think through very seriously, is the US rebalancing to Asia. Of course, this is a sort of mid to long-term prospect. It's not, the US will not vanish from Europe overnight. It will probably stay an important player in European security, but the reality is that Washington will be, and in my view rightfully so, more and more focused on the Asia Pacific, and therefore will be less committed to the security of Europe and its neighborhood. This is making the scenario of Libya and to a certain extent Mali, with the US playing more of a what they call the leadership from behind role, or a supporting role by providing military enablers and support, maybe the most likely scenario, instead of when most of defense planning in Europe was based on the assumptions that the US would take the lead for all important contingencies. This might no longer be true, and I think this is a very, very big challenge to the Europeans, all Europeans, but in a way, in particular for the largest military players such as France and the UK, because they might be forced into taking a leading role, whether they like it or not, and that has happened again in Libya and Mali to a large extent. The second element of the decision is that is weighing extraordinarily heavily, and I already hinted to that, is the financial constraints. Because of the global financial crisis and the debt crisis in the Eurozone and elsewhere, those are having a major strategic impact as the declining defense budget has become the norm in Europe and NATO. This is a very significant trend. I don't think it will be reversed. We should be realistic about it. Some of us might say it's unfortunate, but this is not, we have to deal with that. The fact is that even though defense budgets increase everywhere else in the world, those budgets are declining in Europe and even in NATO, and for that I include North America. Even I think the comparison is a bit biased because given the huge size of the American defense budget, the consequences are not quite the same. This is making things quite difficult because we're in a situation where we see significant military players in Europe moving into a very different situation where they are no longer able to act militarily as they were. And this is a big challenge, including for the largest players such as France, to know if in 10 or 15 years from now, of course this does not happen overnight, we will still be in a position to conduct operations like Mali or to sustain long-term commitments like in Afghanistan. And I think this is a very, very big military challenge for the Europeans, both in their ability to act on their own or in their ability to act with the Americans. And this is definitely a big challenge. In the French case, France so far has been rather protected from these military cuts, but at the moment we are entering a phase where they will take place in the next few months. The next 5 years are likely to be a period of budget austerity, for sure, because obviously there are priorities, and the government has made very clear that restoring, fighting the debt was also a strategic priority, and that we could not escape that commitment. Having said this, depending on the depth of the cuts, we might be either in a situation of muddling through more or less on the same trend, or really changing our level of ambition, and this is one of the key decisions that is currently taking place in Paris with a debate on this. But altogether, this has a broad strategic consequence, and there is a phrase I often use in conferences, which is to say, to wonder whether Europe will become the coalition of the unable and the unwilling, which would be, in my view, not necessarily a good news. So those shrinking defense budgets impose to make choices and to focus on, and eventually hard choices, and to focus on the right priorities. What are our priorities in this context? Obviously, intelligence and intelligence gathering remains a top priority because we know that, and we've learned from the Mali operation or Libya that intelligence is very critical in our ability to try to anticipate crises and solve them ultimately. This is true at the strategic level, at the operational level, and at the tactical level. Therefore, for instance, in the French debate at the moment, there is a big emphasis on the role of reconnaissance drones, UAVs, which in the French case will not be armed, but for the moment will serve as reconnaissance tools. It also forces us to think more in terms of jointness, as the military vocabulary says. Operating jointly means not only that all three services need to work together more and more, but also that we need to be able to act with allies because we simply need them. A good example of that is indeed Mali, where probably 20 years ago we would have seen the commitment of countries like Denmark, Belgium, and others as a political gesture of commitment. It was this time, in many ways, a very useful military contribution. And we would not have been necessarily in a position to do it as easily without such a contribution, even if even the most minor of these contributions. Which means, so in practice, this sort of forces us into more cooperation, and the fact that it becomes more and more difficult, even for the largest European military powers such as France, to act on their own, and this is an important point. Then there are key capabilities that are becoming more and more important. Long-range deep strike capabilities in order to be able to fight an adversary from afar. Special forces have also demonstrated their relevance in many of the recent conflicts. But the problem is, I think we should make no mistake on this, as our forces become slimmer and smaller, it is becoming more difficult to perform all the mission and to sustain a reasonable level of ambition. You can't completely replace manpower and military capabilities by technology and special forces. There is a limit to that logic. And again, Mali was a good example of that. For many years, France did believe that it was possible to handle Mali only through intelligence and special forces, and even though they played a critical role at the outset of the crisis, it was necessary to deploy conventional capabilities to do the job, if I may put it this way. There are very important capability shortfalls in France, as elsewhere in Europe, whether it's long-range and tactical transport, long-range airlift, tactical transport, meaning transport helicopters, drones I already mentioned, and those could turn, and are already turning in several countries, into capability loopholes, as entire sets of capabilities tend to disappear. And this is again creating a problem, as we see many European armies turning into hollow forces with very limited capabilities available for use in combat. which is again creating a problem even for those who sustain a reasonable level of military spending, because they need to fill these gaps as well on top of their own. So that is making things complicated. One way of addressing these constraints, and we've been looking into this in the white paper, is to there are several ways. One is to simply limit your ambitions. You decide that you no longer do large-scale operations, that you no longer go too far, and so on. Is it politically sustainable? It's difficult in a way, but after all, there are many fellow Europeans that do act as free riders in international security. So we could all take that path and hope for the best in that context. I don't expect France to take that path for a series of historical reasons, but nevertheless, we might see a decline in the level of ambition. Another approach is to avoid as much as possible to engage in the most costly and long operations with no clear exit strategy. So there is a sort of comparison between Libya on the one hand and Afghanistan on the other. In Libya, trying to achieve the political objective of seeing Mr. Gaddafi leave power without deploying large amounts of troops on the ground, without committing to that. I mean, this strategy has some limits. Obviously, we see that Libya is not stable, but nevertheless, we did perform the political objective with a very limited force commitment, mostly through air power. And we are trying to achieve more or less through different means, primarily through land operations, the same sort of objectives in Mali, with an operation that hopefully will not last for years, but more for months. Even if I maybe come back to that in the questions, but I don't expect the French to leave Mali anytime very soon. We're probably committed with a smaller operation for a rather extended period of time to the stability of the region. But nevertheless, there is this tendency to focus on operations with a limited footprint, and also an effort to involve others, whether it's regional security cooperation organizations, such as ECOWAS, for instance, or the African Union, whether it's various partners. So, for instance, the effort on training is becoming very, very important as part of our sort of comprehensive approach to conflict, because we need to enable local forces to sort of take over as early as possible in a conflict, instead of having a sort of extended period. All of this is very good on paper, but it very often proves very complicated. As we know, we are in Kosovo since 1999. We have an experience of we are still in Bosnia, and it's very difficult. We're in Lebanon under a blue helmet since 1978. We have a small force in Chad since 1983. So it's you know, to say first in, first out is one thing. To do it is slightly more difficult sometimes. So that's one of the challenges for the future. Last point on this is the importance of partnerships in that context. As you noticed in 2008, France decided to go back into the NATO military structure. This was a very strong political decision which rolled back a political position taken by General de Gaulle in the mid-60s, so it was not an easy decision to make, primarily for domestic political reasons. But the interesting thing is I think that this won't change. And I would like to point at a report written by former Socialist Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine, who was commissioned a report by President Hollande last fall, and came up, even though at the time he had opposed the decision to go back into the NATO military structure, he did write a report making very clear that there was no point in turning this decision back, and that quite the contrary, his position was that we should be firmly engaged in NATO and as much as possible taking the lead in NATO, and that was his political recommendation, and that he didn't see any constraints with the overall and different objectives of pushing forward the common security and defense policy, the CSDP, of the European Union. So we do see a form of, again, sort of consensus on this NATO policy that I think is quite interesting to note. On the EU front, and I know I'm on sensitive ground in Copenhagen on this, the French remain very committed to the building up of CSDP, but they, I think, have become in a way a bit more pragmatic than they were in the early days. They know that it's a long route towards achieving CSDP the way we would like it to be, that the various partners have different views on that within the European Union, and that CSDP is unlikely to become anytime soon any form of replacement for NATO or anything of the sort. Having said this, there are opportunities to push this agenda forward, and one of them is the upcoming defense summit of the EU in December, which we see in Paris as an opportunity to push forward this agenda, and we will see what comes out of it, given the overall context, which is, I must say, not quite favorable. Next to those institutional framework, which, as I was saying, we intend to uphold simultaneously, and we don't see competition in them. And to be honest, I think the main problem at the moment is not so much EU or NATO, but capabilities, and budgets. So I'm not necessarily wanting to go into the theological debates on what is the best organization for doing what. But next to this, we've also developed a lot of bilateral or plurilateral cooperations. An interesting point is the defense cooperation with the UK. In 2010, we signed a series of treaties, the so-called Lancaster House treaties, between the French and the British government. Those are very significant. It's interesting when you look into the details of them, on how much, I mean, if I were to give a sort of subtext and messaging from these treaties, is that you see the two largest military players in Europe that basically admit that they need one another, that they need to cooperate, that they need to pool and share, to use EU language, or to play smart, to use NATO language, and to work together, and to admit that they, I'm almost done, to admit that they are coming very close, that they need to be much closer, and including mutual dependencies on technologies, including military nuclear technology, which is not unheard of on the French side at least. And so I think it's interesting. We also have a tradition of working with Germany, but this has proved politically more difficult, let me be honest on this. But there is a huge network of cooperation with Germany that will not vanish, and we will see whether it can expand. There are currently working in various formats, the so-called Weimar format, which involves Poland, Weimar Plus with other EU partners such as Spain, Italy and Belgium, Weimar plus Visegrad, so there are plenty of multiple settings that are interesting and opportunities to do that. I would add maybe more than a footnote on the US. France is sometimes portrayed as a as a difficult ally in Washington. You remember when the French Prize, the renamed Freedom Prize, in the US Congress. I must say that the depth of the US-French defense cooperation at the moment is at a very, very peak, I should say. It involves intelligence, it's cooperation in Africa, which is a bit of an untold story, but we've been working very, very closely with AFRICOM, the command that the Americans have created for Africa. We've been working extraordinarily closely on Mali with the Americans, and this is something that we see in many fields, from special forces to naval cooperation. We see a lot of work ongoing with the US on a bilateral basis. Lastly, I should mention the Nordics, because we've learned from Libya, indeed, that the Nordics were important partners. So let me finish by saying that I hope that the upcoming defense decisions in France on defense will not lead to a too significant decline in the French defense capabilities in the midterm. So of course, such decisions don't have an impact overnight, but the problem is in 10 years from now. What is sure is that if France will continue to intervene abroad, it will need reliable partners sharing its values, its approach to the use of force, and ready to share the burden of intervention. So thank you very much for your attention.
All of you staying in the room, despite the fact that we now changed the speaker. Ulla asked me to say a few words about the defense agreement, the newly entered Danish defense agreement, and its potential consequences for the so-called Danish activist foreign policy. And that is indeed where I'll take my starting point. But no, I will start by reassuring you that you said that, well, it's slightly controversial to talk about the EU in Copenhagen, and that France is fully committed to building up the CSDP. I can assure you, so are we. I mean, fully committed to France building up the CSDP. The big issue with the new defense agreement, of course, is does that change policy? And I think I'd like to start by taking you on a slight mind trip back to the Cold War, where you could describe, and many scholars have described, Danish defense policy and security policy as that of a civilian actor, a reactive, defensive actor, willing only to employ lethal force as an instrument of survival. So only when faced with existential threats would we commit the military as an instrument of policy. After the Cold War, where we realized that there were no conventional threats in the horizon, there weren't any actor threats at all, we had the liberty of changing that profile or that identity to what could be described as a strategic actor identity. That of a major state, maybe, willing to employ force as a tool or a vehicle for policy in a broader sense. So as a normative tool to provide democracy or human rights changes all throughout the world, or to follow our interests, to press through our interests in the international system. That rested upon a very specific analysis of our not having to defend ourselves. So we did away with our defense in a territorial defense type of logic. We dismantled, we took away, or took down our defense forces' ability to defend Danish territory. So we are in a position now where we cannot, with the employment of defense forces, defend Danish territory. One might argue that we never were able to anyway, but the logic in the old days was that we had a territorial defense capability to commit to NATO Article 5 operations. Now that has been taken away, and the idea was then to create a defense force highly deployable, capable of entering full spectrum international operations all through the world. Sort of, the question was not where to go, the question was with what to go. And the logic behind that, of course, was the alliance logic behind bilateral partnership with the US and NATO alliance membership. The logic, quite obviously, being that if the West is strong, the world is a safer place. The West is only strong if the US and Europe, through the transatlantic relations, remain strong together, for which reason our policies would be aimed at the US. That would have the benefit also of creating bilateral security guarantees, so we would invest political capital and, in that sense, also military capital in terms of deploying into operations, in creating a political profile with Washington that would sort of provide that strong tie between us. That was the logic behind that strategic shift in our own identity. Now the question is whether this new defense agreement changes that. In the rhetorics of the government, and I must remind you that I do not speak for the government or as an official here, I speak as independent me. My boss is here, so you might change that equation in a minute. But the political rhetorics of the government, of course, remains committed to political activism also under the new defense agreement. The question is whether that is a durable position, whether that actually holds up when sort of we are to see the proof of the pudding. And that's going to be my bottom line, I guess, when I close in 17 minutes. That's going to be that the proof of the pudding really lies in the eating. We don't know yet, but we will see, I guess, in a couple of years' time. The logic is the same. The Minister of Defense held a speech at the Center for Military Studies 2 days ago, Tuesday, I think, where he actually said, well, this new defense agreement changes nothing. We are fully committed to upholding our position or profile as a small state with major state ambitions of using the military instrument as a vehicle for an activist foreign policy. But he also said that Denmark must realize now that we are only a small state and we must act accordingly. He also said that we can't act on our own obvious size, but continued by saying that the UN, both as a mandator and as a provider of leadership in operations, will be the main framework for Denmark to operate in military terms. That indeed brings sort of a bill of the future, as well as of the past. Because if we look back to what we did, our old profile of being a civilian actor, that was indeed the rhetorics, that we would only conduct or engage in international operations under a UN frame and in UN-led operations. Now, if that is what we'll see in the future, then that indeed will also be it'll put a question mark on our ability to engage in military activism. He also said that it really does take it does demand a broad majority of Parliament for us to be willing to engage in international operations. That, of course, is with reference. That remark is made with reference to the Iraq War, where we entered the Iraq War with a very narrow majority of Parliament, which still haunts us. We still unfold and roll up scandals of the Iraq War because of that political debate over the war and the justification for our entry. Admitted, Afghanistan was absolutely different, and Libya was the first operation ever for Denmark to engage in with a complete consensus of the Parliament. Which is interesting. The leftist party left that position couple of days later, but they were there to actually vote for the decision to Libya. And I'm going to come back to that because that may actually say something about our ability to cooperate with France as well as well. Now the defence agreement, the new Danish defence agreement, has a very broad parliamentary basis. Only the very leftist party, the remaining socialist party, is not behind it. It claims to have the ambition to maintain our ability and willingness to engage in international operations at the level we have done hitherto. So, no changes to the ambition, no changes to the ability, at least if the argument that we can reduce the defense forces economy by 15% without actually affecting the operational capabilities. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. This defense agreement replaces the defense agreement that started in 2010 and was intended to last until 2014, end of 2014. That defense agreement was underfinanced by something like 7 or 8%. Something like 1.5 billion Danish kroner was the underfinance of that defense agreement. The new defense agreement, which takes us from now to 2017, so another 4 to 5 year terms, depending on how you actually count the effect, cuts the defense forces budget by 15% on top of the underfinancing of the former defense agreement. So in effect, we need to find approximately 3 billion Danish kroner, 15% of the defense budget, in the support structure. Now, one would then argue that that should, of course, be connected with a Danish white paper laying out the tasks for the defense forces, then to figure out how do we then do it, and with what do we do that how. However, we do not have a white paper, and the reason for us not to have a white paper was that the defense agreement had nothing to do with what the defense forces are expected to do, but was only entered as a vehicle for financing the government's tax reform. So the question was not, what do we want the defense forces to do, and what does that cost? But rather, we need to find 3 billion Danish kroner to be able to finance the government's tax reform. Where do we find that money? So what do we cut? If you measure that up against the political ambition of not changing our ability and willingness to engage in international operations with our military forces, then there is only one place to go to find that money. That's in the support structure. So the big if with the defense agreement is whether all the assumptions hold up. If they do not hold up in court, then we will see an underfinancing of the current defense agreement within a couple of years' time, and then all hell will break loose, because then we have to find that money anyhow, but just not the way that we intended to find it within the terms of the defense agreement. And it's not technical at all. It's a matter of if a consulting company says to the defense minister, we can find 700 million Danish kroner by being more efficient in your shop. Right? Fine, you say? We'll go out and do it. But if that assumption doesn't hold up in court, then that money has to be found elsewhere. And can only be found in one place, then that's operational capabilities. That's the one big if. The other big if is whether or not we've reached that capability breaking point that you will have in every defense force. There is ever since the end of the Cold War, we've been cutting our capabilities in quantitative terms. The question is, when do we reach such small quantity of military capabilities that even if they are qualitatively quite superior, they still can't be supported or sustained in operations. I'm not suggesting that we've reached that point yet, but I'm suggesting that we don't know when we reach it, and as Camille was suggesting over lunch, we may find ourselves in a Dutch position where we cross that breaking point without discovering it. And once you've crossed it, there is no way you can regain your, you can refine or reinvent your capabilities in the short run. I'm not suggesting that we are there. I'm just being bluntly open to the suggestion that we're either coming close to it or may actually have reached it. I don't know. The proof of the pudding lies in the eating. We'll see in a couple of years' time. The Army is not, the Navy and the Air Force, the Air Forces are not really affected by the cuts in operational capabilities terms. So I'm not so afraid that they have reached that breaking point at all. But the Army is the big debate. Because we are cutting the Army down, we're calling it falling in the Army, cutting the Army down to one brigade framework with 3 battalion battle groups inside it. The suggestion is that if we need to sustain a battle group in operations over time, sort of a new Afghanistan scenario, then we can unfold the Army again. It will take us a year. Now, that again is an assumption that I'm uncertain whether that will hold on board. There are some very positive issues as well, elements in the defense agreement. On the other hand, that will allow us to actually do more in terms of providing to international operations. We create a special operations command, which will allow, for the first time, Denmark to employ the special operations forces as a strategic instrument. We haven't done that before. Everybody else has done it, just we haven't done it. Now we are getting there too. That's very positive. It's also positive that we create a joint command to actually command or lead operations jointly. That's probably the 2 major steps that we're taking in a positive sense, or constructive sense, with the new defense agreement. But the big issue, of course, is can you cut 15% of your budget without actually affecting your operational capabilities? The logic, now, that the defense agreement aside, the logic behind the whole defense posture and policy that we've seen since mid-90s has been that our policy rests on the assumption that we need to engage in international operations. We need to be deployable, highly deployable, with quick pace, high tempo, and with substantial commitments where our partners would demand that commitment. That too is the logic behind the defense agreement itself. That you could call it a gap-filling logic. That we will be looking for our preferred partners' demand as to what we can contribute to operations with, and then we will try to actually fill that demand. That is a sound logic for obvious reasons. If you have the size to actually be noticed by your preferred partner. I mean, if you don't have the size to provide strategic effect to an operation, or operational effect to an operation, then our preferred partner, just to take an example, the US, would only gain legitimacy by our contributing to operations. So the consequence of that argument is that although the US is our preferred partner and the nation or the state that we aim our strategy towards, so as to shop in a bilateral security guarantee, to shop in a favored status, hopefully most favored status in NATO, and continue to gain all the little symptoms of that most favored status with appointed Danish Secretary Generals, chairman of the military committee, etc. In order to do that, we need to find a partner that will see us as more than just a legitimacy provider, but actually look for strategic or operational effect behind or with our contributions. So, until now, the UK has been our preferred partner in that sense. It makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to orient ourselves or our policies towards one major state partner that will notice us, that will think of us as something that can provide effect that the UK will be seeking. It makes a lot of sense to choose the UK because our policies, as I said before, will by virtue be oriented towards the US. So it's not the UK because of the UK, but it's the UK because of the US. And that indeed is the reasoning behind the September last year bilateral agreement that we made with the Brits. As you will recall, we made a so-called preferred partnership, bilateral preferred partnership agreement, basically laying out a promise from our side that we will engage in operations together with the UK when the UK wishes us to do so. It goes the other way around as well in the agreement, but it goes without saying as well that Denmark will probably not engage in operations then to ask the UK if they want to come along. It's probably going to be the UK asking us. And we've promised to come. That creates two sort of big drivers in the security dynamics of the capability dynamics of the defense forces. One is that we want to make and we need to make ourselves fully plug and play compatible with the Brits, so that when they ask us to come, we can come with a high tempo and plug in something that they need to fill a gap with. We can do that easily and seamlessly. So, plug and play compatibility with the Brits. That's sort of the one driver. The other driver is a policy driver. We need to make sure that when the UK asks us, then we're actually able to fill that demand. That's a political dialogue, of course, and that is the gap-filling logic, the strategic gap-filling logic that I talked about before. Now, one might argue that that would suffice for a small state like Denmark, that we would get exactly what we need by having that bilateral partnership with the Brits. And it also has the big beauty that what we then ask of Britain is for them to provide us with strategic clarity of where they are going in security policy terms. Not that they've done it yet, but they may get around to do that. One might ask, one might assume that one such bilateral relationship would suffice for a small state like Denmark. But I'm not just sure it will, because if we take sort of a step back to where Camille started, namely Denmark in a difficult position within the EU, and Denmark in search of security political alternatives to our current posture. For example, in a situation where we might find that we are willing but not able, then it would make a lot of sense for us to ask France, for example, for a preferred partner, bilateral preferred partner relationship status as well. Not as an alternative to the one we have with the UK, but as a supplement. We've proven now that in Libya and in Mali, or in Kosovo indeed, that we are absolutely able to work together with French defense forces. But we are not fully plug and play compatible. So my argument would be that we would actually further two issues if we would engage in such a dialogue about a bilateral partnership. The one issue was to force our defense forces to drive towards plug-and-play compatibility with France as well as with the UK. That would be healthy for the French forces, maybe painful, but healthy. The other issue, of course, is to, if not circumvent the opt-out of the CSDP Denmark has, but then at least to provide a possibility of compensating for the effect, the negative effect it has that we cannot be part of the common European security and defense policy. So that would be my sort of suggestion. We should enter in dialogue to make a bilateral partnership. Now, what do I want to take away from all this mumbo jumbo? I think the big conclusion to any sort of evaluation of our current defense agreement must be that we don't really know which consequences it will have. We know that it must have severe consequences to cut back 15% of your budget, but we don't know which political and capability consequences it might have. The proof of the pudding lies in the eating. We'll see in a couple of years' time. And we'll probably see when the next big operation demands either French, UK, or US, indeed, or NATO, would demand land forces contributions from our side. Because of course we can contribute with a warship to anti-piracy operations. Of course we can contribute with an aircraft to Mali, or a couple of F-16s to Libya, or Syria, or Iran, or wherever we are going. But when the next big demand comes up for a sustainable deployment of land forces to a land operation heavy theater, like for example one in Syria to perform a stability operation or whatever, then that will be when we will see that proof of the pudding. Yes, ma'am. I think I'll end then by saying that with the rhetorics of the government in presenting, during the presentation of the defense agreement, there remains no doubt that we still have the ambitions, we still are willing. The question is whether we will be able in 2 or 3 years' time when the next big demand comes around. So I'll end by saying currently we are so able and so willing that tomorrow we may be just willing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being so keen on dialogue and cooperation and partnership. It's not bad. Everybody speaks about dialogue for the time being. So this is wonderful. But I would say that to intervene or not to intervene is not the question, because we intervene. And to cut the defense budget is the question. How? So, and another question is, our different political culture was very evident in the presentation. So even if we dialogue, there is a difference as for our institutional system, as for how we decide the defense budget, how we decide intervention. And as far as I know, there was an amendment of the French Constitution in 2008 where it was said that after the president had to talk to the parliament at least 3 days after the intervention has happened, and after 3 months of intervention, or 4 months, I think it was, wasn't it? 4 months, I think. You had to bring the discussion up in the parliament, but without any voting, as far as I remember. So it's still the president who intervenes, so to say, whereas it is the parliament here which intervenes. So
Or the Queen.
Or the Queen, okay. It's the President and the Queen, and they're going to have a dialogue together. So I think we have to have a break now, and you take Danish coffee, unfortunately not French café au lait, but well, and Danish small cookies, unfortunately not petit four. But off you go, and you so you have to come back 4:20. Absolutely, and I will be very, very hard.
From the Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Thank you both for some very, very interesting and fantastic presentations. I have a question, two questions that are coupled one for each of you, because evidently the point where you two presentations connect is on the issue of how to deal with allies, either bigger ones or smaller ones, and how to make that fit together. And so, since I brought it up almost 2 years ago about France as a strategic partner, as a supplement to the UK, I don't disagree with your argument, Ole, at all. But I would actually put you to a little bit of a test, because following the logic of compatibility, you would also want interoperability, and the easiest way to achieve that is to have the same gear. So if we actually do marry ourselves also to the right or left hand to the French in this way, wouldn't this mean that instead of buying the best tank, the Leopard 2, the next time we buy stuff, we should buy the second best, namely the French or the English tanks? So that is a difficult task. And then for you, Camille, I would ask, because the role of the anticipatory analysis took up a very prominent place in the 2008 white paper, and this was a brilliant step, I think, and another sign of great French analysis, because this really went to the core of everything that has happened since internationally in terms of moving upstream in dealing with conflict. So again, that France was much ahead of the pack. And this goes to Ole's presentation, because as you said, with the Danish-UK bilateral agreement, there was also a promise, not yet fulfilled, that we would be somehow led into some deeper analysis. And would you see that the thoughts happening inside the white paper on jointness or working with allies will also include letting some of the closer allies into that kind of closer intel analysis loop?
Excuse me.
Question mark.
Okay. Very intelligent that you added that. Excuse me, I think that the next persons have to get to their feet, because I think it's a bit difficult to hear what is going on without micro, so please get up.
I'll start. On the need to buy the same hardware. Definitely it's helpful. Of course, we all live by NATO standards, so the interoperability can be performed with French, US, British, or German hardware most of the time. There are a few where it becomes interesting to look into this, is in terms of cost saving. So if we are able to operate jointly a fleet of, let's say, tankers for air-to-air refueling, or to operate jointly a fleet of for strategic airlift or helicopters and things like that, there might be opportunities to be more cost efficient together. This is a very tricky issue, because of course in many cases when we cooperate, there are costs to cooperation, especially if we allow each army to have its own design requirements, and then you end up, and this was the case with the NH-90 for instance, with many versions of the same helicopter, and ultimately you don't save costs on acquisition, and you might not even save costs on maintenance. So it's a tricky thing, but I think we can do much better. Both the EU and NATO have been working on this, and I think it's something where we can definitely work together. on either on a bilateral basis or within more institutional frameworks. But I think there are opportunities to do that because it's useful. On the issue of intellectual sharing, and I think there is a lot of room to cooperate more deeply on these issues. It starts with strategic intelligence, and I think we need, for instance, the French have not always been extremely good at making our case of why Africa is important. We've been rather convincing in Copenhagen, but we need to, in general terms, make clear, and I cannot overemphasize this enough, that, for instance, when we are in Mali, there is no hidden post-colonial agenda there. Basically, the decision to go was very much based on an immediate threat assessment, based on the threat that the government in Bamako would fall, and that we would end up with another Afghanistan in the middle of the Sahel that would create far more difficulties and turmoil for the future. In doing this, if we are sharing more strategic analysis with allies ahead of the crisis, we have far more chances of bringing allies on board when the crisis breaks out. And to be honest, we've not always been extremely good at that, so we can definitely do better. And I think in more general terms, it is worthwhile to expand the dialogue on the strategic challenges. I think that at NATO, for instance, there is not enough of this. NATO does focus a lot on management of the current crisis, but is not extremely good at discussing potential challenges and whether the alliance is involved or not. And this was a debate we had when we were working on the future strategic concept, the 2010 strategic concept. I was involved in that exercise when we argued that we should sort of revamp the so-called Article 4 consultations in the alliance, which is the principle that the alliance can discuss an issue even if the alliance is not committing troops to the problem and is not ready to act, which would be more than Article 5 contingency. And in that context, I think we can actually expand such consultations, and sometimes it's a bit difficult, including for the French, to do that, because sharing intelligence is not always easy, and it's probably easier on a bilateral basis. So than in an alliance framework. So for that, I would certainly advocate more of this, more of these exchanges, including on issues which are not, the top priority for a given country. There are challenges in the north and part of Europe that the French are not fully aware of, and they should certainly benefit from exchanges on what is the perception of our Nordic partners on what's going on in the Arctic. And that would be definitely useful for understanding of the region, and also that would help us eventually make the case for a stronger commitment on our part to face some of these challenges. And of course the reverse is true for regions with which we are more familiar, whether it's Africa or the Mediterranean, with some of our other European partners that might see that as a bit remote from their perspective, and that need to have a good understanding and eventually a detailed understanding of the reasons for cooperating on a given crisis. And if we do it ahead of the curve, it's easier than doing it in the midst of the crisis, where there might always be suspicions of forms of hidden agenda on the part of the country taking the lead on a specific operation.
I'll completely take your point. The logic behind interoperability would demand us to go all the way, also to common procurement of standard stuff. That's not going to happen. Not in my lifetime, not in many years. We will get F-35s. We will, I promise you. We will not get Rafael or the Swedish stuff or anything. We'll get the real stuff. And that is exactly where we will end in all those political discussions about interoperability. We will end up having all kinds of other issues on the table, all other arguments on the table, rather than just the pure logical interoperability argument of the alliance. However, having said that, then the suggestion that NATO interoperability is the key then to go as far as we can, I will buy into that. Smart defense solutions, common procurement, pooling and sharing of capabilities, definitely. Look at my Admiral's 3 new missile frigates. We can't afford to buy the radar to make them compatible with the American demands for our engaging in or taking part of the ballistic missile defense. So we need to do that together with someone. If we can get France to pay for German radars that we can borrow or whatever, then fine with us. Yeah, the other way around. Doesn't matter. Yeah, probably the other way around these days.
Ask for some missiles as well.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be my take on it. That smart defense solutions, where we would, for example, have pooling and sharing of German, Dutch, Danish, Norwegian radars, missiles, whatever costs we need to make the frigates compatible with a ballistic missile defense would make sense. One thing is that we talk, when we talk smart defense solutions and investment in them, our problem is that we don't have any money. We are out. We can't afford stuff at the moment. So all the political ambitions will probably, it will have a lead-in time of up to 5 years before we can actually do something about it, because we can't afford to be taking active part in smart defense solutions at the moment.
Excuse me, except for the armored personnel carriers and the maritime helicopters.
Except for the projects that we have started, yes.
Except for the things you actually outlined,
yeah. Sure.
May I just add a footnote to deepen the debate on this? First of all, there is one element which I think is important, and this has been an argument that I've had with a very prominent Danish figure with a leading role in NATO, which is to say that smart defense can deliver with money. You can't, 0 plus 0 still equals 0. So it's, if it's only a bumper sticker to say let's be smart, you need some, money with it, and eventually you will get some savings ultimately. But it's this way around and not, the other way around. My second comment is on probably a difference between France and Denmark on these issues, and which is to say that France, as a handful of other European countries, still has a very substantial defense industry. And in that context, I must tell you that you can't convince, part of the selling pitch for spending on defense is that our industry benefits from it. And it will be extraordinarily difficult. If smart defense is only about buying American because it's cheaper, which it's not, in fact it's more expensive, but that's another story. To buy American because it's cheaper, that won't sell. Missile defense is a good example. Maybe the French will be involved in some of the NATO missile defense thinking, but it will be based on the European technology we're developing jointly with the Italians and potentially others. We will not be in a position, because that's a non-starter in given financial constraints, to just say that it's smarter to pool and share and buy together SM3 or things like that. And that has been a big debate in NATO on the issue of common funding, for instance, that the French have resisted, because basically the French position on this is pretty simple. It's to say common funding is a way for us to pay 3 times, to pay as a reasonable spender, to pay as a country that is deploying troops abroad when others are acting as free riders, and to pay a 3rd time to complement their budget, because and we get, of course, as France, it's about 13% of any common funding decision goes to France. So that's why we've been extremely reluctant to go too much into that direction, and the industry dimension should not be forgotten from our perspective.
Okay, thank you for your interventions. The next person is down there, and you present yourself. What was it?
My name is Christina Beckert. I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's such a pleasure to see you here again, Camille. See you in Denmark. I used to see you in Paris, where you were one of my best sources for information on the NATO, the French reintegration into the military structures of NATO. That was back in 2009. And I'll get to the question perhaps now already, so I don't get told off. I'm looking for ways to further enhance the Danish-French security cooperation. Some ideas have already been mentioned, and Ole Kværny, you mentioned the idea of something similar to the preferred partnership agreement. If there are other ideas have also been mentioned. If there are further ideas, I would really appreciate hearing about it, because I'm already happy and proud to see how well our two countries are working together. It doesn't matter what government we have leading us. We've both changed governments during the last few years, and whether it's Sarkozy or whether it's Hollande in front, you're looking to Denmark as well. Not least to the north of Denmark, just when you're looking for support. I don't know whether you're looking for. I think you're looking for more than just the legitimacy. You were mentioning, Ole Kværny, that as Denmark we can provide legitimacy. I think you're also looking for capacities, and we're also proud that you do that, and you did that in terms of Mali, and we were happy to be there right from the beginning. And we were very proud when Hollande actually said, one of the first days of the Mali intervention, that he had already gained the support of the US, the UK, Denmark, and other big, powerful nations, or something like that. So we were happy to see that. But if there are further suggestions, I mean, it's a bit of an untold story, like you were saying, the French-American relationship. In strategic matters, but also the Danish-French relationship. I don't know whether many Danes are aware of this, or for that matter, apart from Mr. Hollande of that in France. So, how do we also tell the story? That's another aspect of it. But first of all, are there more ideas as to how to do this right into the details?
Nope. I'll give it a shot. First of all, I think that one thing is to do what we're doing now and to do more of this. And I think in a way, Christina, you remember that we've created at the Foundation a Nordic program. At the moment, it's only the Finns that are involved in it. But I would definitely, I think it makes sense to have more of these exchanges, because. To be honest, I'll give you one very specific example. I'm involved. I'm writing the French chapter for the RAND study on the Libya war, which, as any RAND corporation study, is meant to be the definitive study on the Libya war. I learned through that process, which was a very, we went to several seminars and things like that, the extent of the Nordic, including Danish involvement in the Libya war, which was, of course, the French, because they tend to sometimes be a bit too focused on Franco-British or Franco-American cooperation. They a bit overlooked the contribution of, especially Denmark and Norway, into this. This is the sort of story that should be told beyond the experts' circles, because those expert circles are aware of it. But if the only persons aware of it is the Denmark desk officer in the general staff and the defense attaché, that's not exactly the sort of audience you want to target. So I think in a way you want to go beyond that by sort of expanding it. I'm not sure this is going to make way into the general public, of course, but I think we need to find ways that those that deal with NATO, with operations, with procurement, think Denmark in Paris, and the other way around. And of course this applies the other way around, so that we sort of leave the small club that is directly involved in the bilateral relationship to make it something slightly more visible. And as I was saying, I think we have no other choice in many ways. The problem is that it's no longer a matter of legitimacy or political gesture. We really very much need each other. And I think I was saying about the Franco-British defense cooperation, that it was a very strong and probably underestimated the fact that those two countries, which have a long past together and against each other, had decided to be mutually interdependent on some key issues. If this is and this sort of interdependence applies to other partners, and I think probably the French have to learn that there are so-called smaller partners that are relevant and important, but that as well some of these partners that have been very focused on the relationship with the US or the UK or Germany, depending on the countries, could also look further a little more and to consider options for working together. And to be honest, I don't see any barriers anymore. I think the language barrier was very strong for a number of years because the French were mostly, the French military was mostly French-speaking, and it was a bit difficult. I think this is no longer applicable today in most of the daily life. Of course, it creates some problems if you want to have a trainee in the War College, you need to someone who's French-speaking, but that's, beyond those very specific issues, it is not an issue for cooperation on the ground. It's not an issue for cooperation on things like that, and I think we can be working on that. This applies, by the way, also to the strategic level, and I think it could be interesting to explore ways to exchange diplomats in the strategic sphere, to do joint policy planning work and all these things that are useful to know each other a little better and to work together. I think the French have made an effort that they are not quite up to where I would want them to be, of looking beyond the great partners, which was a bit of a problem for a long time. It seemed that we were so focused on Germany, the UK, the US, that we paid little if no attention to even to any other European in a way. I think this is changing. We see that with countries like Poland. We see that with the Nordic countries. But I think there is an effort to engage beyond that. The Baltic states, some other more southern European partners, including when they are in problem. For instance, at the moment, the Weimar Plus format. Many in Paris say we need to engage the Spaniards. And Spaniards are in the worst possible situation ever in the field of defense at the moment. They are very much in a deep hole and they keep digging in a way. But the decision was made that it was worthwhile to keep engaging them, because hopefully one day they will be in a position to be an active partner again. And that day, the fact that we've been there and been engaging while they were in this deep trouble was worth, that there would be a benefit from that. So it's a very, I think the ties, it's a process that you need to repeat on almost on a daily basis. I mean, the more of these conferences, the more of the staff exchange you can do, the more of the diplomats exchange you can do, the more of the joint efforts you can do, the better we end up in a way. Of course, there are limits to this. You can't produce 5 French-speaking officers to send them to the École de Guerre every year. And anyway, that would be difficult, and you also need to engage other partners. But having said this, the more we do it, the better it is. And those are have limited costs. Unfortunately, in terms of defense austerity, these are typically the costs you cut, because you say, okay, well, do we really need that attaché or that cooperation individual? This is the sad truth, but I think it's unfortunate because for very limited cost you have significant benefits in the long run.
Cost-wise too. Yeah.
Just very briefly, I would agree. I think it's the MOU, a preferred partnership, bilateral partnership agreement would be a brilliant idea for several reasons. I don't want to go back into that, but it would create an opportunity for us to, okay, let's be blunt, circumvent our very problematic opt-out of the Edinburgh Agreement. And that's the other sort of side of the coin, that it would also create a major political driver. One might argue that it's just a political agreement on good intent, yes, but it may just prove to be a very forceful strategic driver. So a bilateral agreement, brilliant idea. Otherwise, let's cooperate in operations. Military international operations are the flagship of Danish activist foreign policy. So if we can cooperate, every time we can find an opportunity to engage in operations together, plug into French operations in Mali or French-led operations over Libya, let's do it. And then, of course, I agree with Camille on the other suggestions.
And now it's your down there.
I'm Dr. Kivit, student ambassador to Denmark. We all know that Europe is in a debt crisis, and there is a passionate debate between austerity measures and spendings, and we all have to find money somewhere. Especially the defense sector is a very specific one, and if you destroy once already some capabilities, so you need, after all, years to build them up again. And now we have in both countries, in France and in Denmark, leftist governments. And do you mean that these governments have done enough to advocate the specific needs of the defense sector? Also in France, if you have, where you have the nuclear deterrence, and you must really keep the necessary basis, technological and industrial one, and also research and development in the nuclear sector. So it is easier maybe to hear the voice and to see the demonstration of teachers and medicines and other sectors on the street, but what to do with the army or with the nuclear industry sector? Is the leftist government able to support them? And can we use now Mali case both for our domestic debates, in Denmark also to relaunch the debate to get rid of the defense opt-outs, also for Europe de la Défense, and also maybe for NATO 2% commitment. So we cannot say too much in order to be victims later on, or as you ended your intervention, maybe we will end up being only willing and not able anymore in 5 years. When Mali would happen in 5 years, what then?
First of all, the assumption that we have a leftist government is an interesting one. I can quote our Minister of Finance from 2 days ago, who made absolutely certain that one should not mistake the Danish government or the Social Democrats for being a leftist party. An interesting notion. So I'm not so sure that it's a leftist government. But have they destroyed our capabilities development to an extent where we can't get back? That was one of my key points in my this analysis, if you will. I'm not sure. I don't know if we have reached that breaking point. I know that we are moving towards it. That quantitative capability breaking point where if we cross it, we will find ourselves in a very difficult position. We will find it very difficult to get back into to reacquiring capabilities that we thought we had but didn't in reality. But honestly, I don't know. The other question with on the defence opt-out, the Edinburgh Agreement, defence opt-out, or the Maastricht Treaty, there is no way I can see a political dynamics leading to the government taking the chance of running the risk of bringing this debate up. It's not about defence, it's about all the other stuff. It's about the euro. And we simply can't discuss those opt-outs at the moment. It would be too politically risky for the government to do it. So I don't think it won't happen. And the reason for it, we keep saying that well, why don't we just bring up the defence opt-out? Because everybody agrees that it's a nuisance, and we should just get away with it. But frankly speaking, the defence issue is ranked 19 out of 20 political agendas relevant to the public. So if you, when we conduct polls and ask the electorate, where do you see defence policy come in as in a ranking of political issues? It's last. So I can't see it happening.
I'd have a rather nuanced answer to the issue of the leftist government or not. I mean, we have a socialist green majority in France. If you look in the long term, in the last 30 years, the periods where the left was in charge were not worse than the periods when the right was in charge. Basically, you see more or less the same trends in defense spending altogether. So you don't, in France at least, there are not huge differences. Having said this, it is clear that, for instance, at the moment, the Hollande government has made clear that it had priorities during the election, which were not defense. So it's education, police, and justice were identified as the priority ministries, which would be exempt to a certain degree of the contraction in public spending. So that is making things a bit difficult, because obviously the decision has not been taken to treat defense as part of this. The difficult issue, and I think it ought to become a public debate in many European countries, is that when you spend, because of course 2% threshold is hardly met by anyone, and I know Estonia is doing a hard job doing that, but it's a rather unique case within Europe. I mean, Britain is close to it. Greece, but I'm not sure this is the best example. So we are in, there are very few countries in Europe. It has become a very theoretical objective. So I think at the moment the key issue is to stop the slide, and having moved from 2% to 1.5 to shift to 1% as the new norm would be already a good thing to avoid that from happening. What I think that in terms of public debate, we ought to make clear that currently, in France we had a long debate in the 90s about the peace dividends. Where do we should extract the peace dividend from the post-Cold War era. And in fact we did it, because we moved from 3% of the GDP to 1.5, so that has happened even though it was not a real political choice. So the problem is that now we are down to a situation where defense spending is roughly, in France, 1.5% of the GDP, moving towards 1.3, 1.1, depending on the decisions that are going to be taken, bringing us to the norm of the other European partners. But it's only 10% of government spending. So basically, the problem is that defense is not the solution to your budget problem, because if you were to completely stop spending a single euro on defense in France, you would save 30 billion, which is only half of what the debt costs us on a yearly basis. So you're not even solving your entire problem by getting rid of defense altogether. And in fact, you're creating other problems for the industry, for the economy. You're putting a lot of people that are in the industry that are qualified workers. This is precisely what we want to keep, an industry that is not too much subject to the effect of globalization. You are putting, and the army has always also as a sort of training path for youngsters with no diploma. So, I mean, all these social problems you're creating on the margins of your decisions to do that. And in the last 5 years, so that was on the right, we downsized by 7,500 every year, which is the size of the major downsize, you know, the sort of things that make the headline news for any company, you know, Peugeot or things like that. I mean, it's a huge unrest because there were 7,500 people that lost their job. This is what the Ministry of Defense has been doing every year in France in the last 5 years. So, I mean, all these figures are not known to the public, and I think we need to move that into the public debate a little bit. Having said all of this, of course, financial, having a balanced budget and being reasonably serious on the debt is also a strategic objective. And none of our governments can afford living above their payroll forever, unfortunately, one might say, but that's the hard truth. So we are caught between a rock and a hard place in a way, because I think everyone is aware, including the military, that efforts need to be made. On the other hand, there is a very big concern that if this effort weighs too heavily on the military, the consequences will be far beyond elsewhere. But to a certain degree, the same sort of logic applies to ministries of foreign affairs and things like that. At a certain point, when if you keep cutting, you really break the tool. So that's I think a very big challenge. But my real point is really to say, if you look in the French case, defense spending is only about 3% of the overall public spending. You know, we spend 56% of our GDP on public spending. When you add social security, health service, retirement benefits, local governance and things like that. So it's not the solution to the problem. You know, it's not as if we were crazy big spenders that were, you know, we're not North Korea. We're not, and I'm not advocating that in any case. I don't intend for us to spend 25% of our GDP on defense or 80% of the state budget on defense. That's not the objective. That was the case in France in 1830, by the way, but but there is, so the thing is to, how do we keep what is reasonable? And so is it the 1.5 threshold? That's what the French Senate has been advocating recently. Is it 10% of the government budget, which seems a reasonable thing for something that is so essential for sovereignty? I don't know, but it's a very, very difficult trade-off to make for any president, and I'm not sure it's a right or left issue.
Okay, we take in only one more question, because even if everybody wants to discuss maybe until 8 o'clock in the evening, I think the families need their parents, and you need your plane, maybe. I don't know, but I think it is up to you.
I'm Jane Larsen. I come from an international NGO called International Media Support, based in Copenhagen. And I'm very curious in relation to the case of West Africa and Mali, and also your information on the training of the local troops, etc., the collaboration with the ECOWAS and African Union, and vis-a-vis the budget cuts we're talking about, and the lowering of expenditures for defense and military. the presumption could be that then the military has to work smarter in relation to when they withdraw from a certain situation. I don't know, my curiosity is if there are any issues in your white paper concerning that. How are you going to work smarter with the local forces, with this capacity building of local forces? And also, are there any considerations on how the military will work with international development agencies to sort of take over when you move out of now Mali? It could be another geopolitical context, but it's very interesting from my point of view in relation to what will be the longer term if it's not a military intervention.
I think you have a very, very strong point, and we should be fully aware that we won't solve the Mali situation only with military force. And this is clear, and this is obvious. In the white paper, there is an interesting part that I hope will remain, and yet I've been involved in some of the working groups, so I don't know whether it will make its way into the final document, about the comprehensive approach. And for the first time, the French are laying out their vision of that, which is incredibly interesting. And as you know, the chairman of the White Paper Commission is the former UN Deputy Secretary General in charge of peacekeeping operations, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, and he's very, very aware of these issues and how do we work and integrate much better the work of NGOs, the work of international organizations, the work of the military, and the political dimension. And I think in Mali, success cannot be defined only by the fact that and that has been the case, we succeeded in sort of breaking the backbone of the jihadist network, but that is not long-term success, that is short-term success. For long-term success, there needs to be an overall long-term commitment to governance in Mali, and beyond the military, the military and beyond, to working for a political solution with the Tuaregs, which is part of the issue very much, to creating the conditions for a better governance. I'm afraid we're not going to turn Mali into a Nordic democracy in a year. But having said this, we've not succeeded in Afghanistan in 10 years. But nevertheless, what we can do certainly is to work for some, to incorporate as early as possible in the management of such crises this dimension of what the so-called comprehensive approach, which is to really bring in those actors that are usually a bit, coming in later in the process, to have them as early as possible. And this is where the EU training mission is extraordinarily important, because the EU training mission is building up the capacities of the African force to do this job. And honestly, if I were to be a bit cynical, I would say that's our exit, that's our key to the exit. If this force is unable to do anything, we'll have to stay for an extremely long time, or we might have to depart in a situation that is unresolved. If this force is reasonably able to do things, that will be the basis for stability, and then we can work on and we should work, in fact, at the same time, on broader issues of governance and development for the Sahel region, starting with Mali, but this applies to the neighboring countries as well. So it's a very, very tricky and long-term effort. The French have been engaged for a number of years in what was called the ROCAM, so capacity building for peacekeeping in Africa, which has not been always extraordinarily successful, but at least it's a building block that we can sort of develop there. And we definitely would welcome more support from partners into this effort, because there what you need is money and trainers, and the more of us are involved, the better it is. So I don't see any competition with the military operation, because the military are there to restore stability, with as little collateral damage as possible. And this is very important, of course, and the French are paying a lot of attention to this, and sometimes with delays, and that was the case in Libya, we could probably have done much better in terms of delays had we not paid attention to these, but we've been extremely careful on this collectively, and I think it was important for the legitimacy of the operation. This is absolutely, and I think the white paper will recognize that, critical in your management of those crises in the future.
Make sure to make it brief, but if we were to discuss comprehensive approach in civil military relations, we could stay here all night, I'm sure. But it's such a relevant question. I spent well over a year of my life in southern Afghanistan as NATO's chief governance, responsible for integrating the two civilian lines of operation into the security line, so into the military operations. So I might be a bit disillusioned as to the perspective of doing that. So I think I'll leave it at a health warning. If we are to truly develop a comprehensive approach to international operations, integrating both civilian governmental actors and non-governmental organizations such as yours, then we must, from the side of the military, in particular NATO, we must shy away from our illusion that we can integrate you into our staff processes of linear planning. That can't be done. It won't work. You won't accept it. So what we've done so far is to invite all the civilian actors in to say, well, you just become part of our processes, then we can make joint planning, integrated planning, we can plan for the civilian effects, and in that way we can truly develop a comprehensive approach to operations. It won't work. It doesn't work anymore. And I think that it's dawning on us in NATO now that is it's the wrong way to go about things. And that's what we miss in comprehensive approaches at the moment. That's going from the level of good intentions where we all agree that it's a good idea. It's the civilian lines of operation winning the war and lead the peace, not the military. But it's going from that to implementation in the field. That's where it really becomes difficult. And one dimension of that is what we do in Africa, military, what Denmark does in Africa in particular, military capacity building. Not to be too bold on France's part, but France is suffering less from fear of risk of military capacities being used to the wrong end once we've developed those capacity than we are in Denmark. Rwanda is a very good example of it. We started military capacity building in Rwanda, we came late and then we broke early because we were suddenly surprised that, wow, these military capacities might be used to something that will violate human rights and will not further democracy. That was not what we intended. So we stopped the program. And that probably is the risk willingness that we will have to accept if we are to develop military capacities. France, probably because of your colonial past, is much better at taking that strategic risk than we are at the moment. And that goes for a number of little states in Western Europe, and Northern Europe in particular. So if we are to truly use that vehicle of military capacity building as a tool in preventive military diplomacy, in stabilization operations, peacekeeping operations, or whatever, then we must be prepared to take the risk of that tool going astray.
If I may add one quick footnote to that, I think we also need to learn our lessons. I mean, Rwanda was a counter-example in many ways, and the French military remember that very vividly. Where we need to be, probably one way of addressing that is also working with regional organizations, whether it's the EU, or the African Union, or the ECOWAS, for instance, because then you're a bit less in the situation where you're training people that will ultimately do a coup somewhere or something like that. You can do it more on a regional basis, and that's one way of doing it when you do long term. Of course, when you're in the midst of an operation, you're more constrained.
Okay, I don't know whether you want us to continue? There are 2 more questions. Do you want it, or are you polite? I can't decide to say.
You must. You must decide.
Very often I decide, especially at home. But I think we better have to stop. I think because it's so hot inside here. So I want to thank you very deeply for a highly interesting and inspiring conversation, dialogue, analysis, and I hope we will continue with different kinds of bilateral arrangements and comprehensive arrangements to one of the, what should I say? You said,
Why is coming with? Do you want to announce the next conference?
Yes, yes.
Sorry.
Okay, okay. But it's coming to the website.